So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination um, for the work that we've been doing in January 130, the readings, and the prep guide. So one of the questions that we started with was this issue of risk aversion. Um, so if you think for a minute, I want to put you in a scenario. You have $100 to invest. Now you can invest it in a savings account and you can get 1%. Or you can invest in mutual funds. You can earn up to 5%, but you could also lose up to 4%. These are risky investments. Or you can invest in stocks for a possible return of 20%, but you could lose up to 10%. What do you do? If we sort of graph the possible options, my gains are over here and my losses are over here. So in a savings account, I can gain $1. In mutual funds, I can gain 4, but I can gain 5, but I could also lose 4. I'm not sure what the market is going to do determines where I'm going to be in here. Stocks, I could gain up to 20%. It's not unheard of, but I could also lose 10%, like we've seen in recent days. So this you might choose to invest in, or this, the mutual funds or savings. So it depends on your degree of risk aversion. Now, what you'll notice is that on average, in the first two scenarios, you'll earn 1% in the long run. Okay, in the long run, you're going to earn 1% in savings. In the long run, you're going to win sometimes, you're going to lose sometimes, you're going to win sometimes, you're going to lose sometimes, you're going to win. And the net, though, is going to be plus 1%. Generally speaking, that's how we model this. In stocks, you're going to win big sometimes, but then you might lose big, and you might win a little, and you might lose a little. You might win big again and lose a little, and you might win a little bit and lose and lose. In the long run, your gain is going to be 10% in this scenario, okay? So that means your expected value is going to be 1% gain in the first two scenarios. In the third scenario, it should be 10%. Now, in classical economics, should say that everybody should invest in stocks, but we don't. Many of us invest in savings accounts. Many of us invest in mutual funds. It depends on our degree of risk aversion and risk proneness. So risk aversion is the choice of a more certain but less valuable outcome relative to a less certain but potentially more valuable outcome. Risk proneness is the choice of a less certain but more valuable outcome relative to a more certain but less valuable. So it's reverse. So risk aversion is we avoid risk. Risk proneness is that we seek it. All right. So a savings account is a risk averse. We're choosing the sure thing over something that might produce more gain. Mutual funds, you can basically, we would probably say that a person is risk neutral there, whereas if you're stocks, you're risk prone. Okay. So when we talk about riskiness and risk aversion, risk proneness, and we talk about the value of certain things, I want us to expand our idea about what we are talking about when we talk about value of things. Sure, it involves money, the value of money, the value of material goods, awards, and so on. But we can also think about how valuable is pride to you or to someone? How valuable is euphoria? How valuable are bragging rights to certain people? And we all know certain people are much more into bragging, or status or pride, right? What about opportunity? Is there a value to opportunity? Is there a value to your standing in a particular group? And the argument is that these all have value, and that we might be risk prone or risk averse with respect to each one of these things. You might say, well, I don't care too much about the rush of euphoria that I might experience doing things. But a person that really likes snowboarding, maybe euphoria is, maybe that's why they do it, is that's a very valuable outcome to them. If we talk about doing something, what why would we do drugs? Why would you take drugs? Why would you smoke pot? Why would you trip? Why would you do those things? Well, we know that there are risks and benefits associated with doing drugs. You could have a good trip, you can have fun, you can escape, you can have a reputation as a fun party guy, kind of guy or gal or whatever. There are also risks associated with health. You could have a bad trip. This could conflict with your social morals and values. You could get a reputation as a burnout, as a druggie, as an addict, as a pothead, as a whatever. So there are both benefits and risks associated with doing drugs. Extreme sports. You can get an adrenaline rush. You can say, hey, I climbed El Capitan. Nobody, there's only 100 people that ever done that. But you can also hurt yourself. You can injure yourself. When we have sex, there are benefits and there are risks. It's fun. It feels good. You get a reputation as as a lover, as whatever, this, that, or the other thing. But you could also get a disease. You could get a bad reputation as sleeping around, as a slut, as a whatever. You could get pregnant or get someone pregnant. These are all risks associated with having sex. Now, what if we talk about changing our society so that all of us have equal rights and opportunity? Is there a value for that? Well, there is a value for that. Everybody has some sort of value attributed to that. What are the benefits? Well, the benefits of equal rights are that the gain what we see as money, power, and privilege going to those without it. And what we might see is that money, power, and privilege being lost by the people that have it. So, if you're politically, socially supporting equal rights and opportunity for all, are you likely going to gain something or lose something? And if you are risk averse, you're going to minimize your losses. So, maybe part of these prejudicial discrimination, stereotyping responses that we see, the behavior of our culture, is because it means that someone's going to lose something and they don't want to lose it. So, as I've talked about in other places, the question becomes, is this a zero-sum game? Is someone else's gain my loss? Or is one group losing means another group wins in these sorts of contexts? Well, you have to look at the situation and you have to ask, is this the case? And in many cases, I don't know that is. If we all have equal rights, I don't know that anybody loses anything. Maybe, but I don't think so. If more African Americans or more Latino Americans or Hispanic Americans or more whatever group are admitted to UW-Whitewater, does that mean your prospects decrease? I think that's highly unlikely. I think that you're gonna get in, and if a few more of an out group get in, it doesn't affect us that much. So it doesn't affect the majority groups that much. I think there are a lot of situations in which it's being called a zero-sum game when it really isn't. Taxation is one of these things. A lot of people think, well, if I pay more taxes, I'll have less money to spend. And that's true. But when you pay taxes, you're also paying likely for services that you'd have to purchase anyways. So part of our taxes go to for things like garbage collection. The guys that come and pick up our garbage at the, once a week, we pay for that in our taxes. If we didn't pay our taxes and garbage collection was eliminated, that means we'd have to pay for garbage collection. I mean, we don't pay for the police. We don't pay for the firemen. If our house is burning, the fire department doesn't come and say, okay, well, I need to write you a bill before I can put out this fire. the fire's put out and it's paid for by in many of those things are paid for in our taxes. If our taxes increase, presumably we might receive more services. Think about this. What if the roads were better? Would servicing our car cost less? I mean, if you're driving on a road that's all bumpy and full of potholes and so on, maybe you're needing to get your car alignment serviced every once in a while, get new tires and so on. Maybe if the roads were better, you wouldn't have to pay for that. Okay. Tokenism is a situation in which only a few members of a previously excluded group are admitted. This is a really famous case of the undergraduate application packet to the University of Wisconsin was sent out. This is what was sent out. This is the original picture. And if we look, it's been a black guy photoshopped into the picture. He's a token. He is a token in this case. We see tokenism because these are attempts to undermine claims of sexism, racism, discrimination, etc. We don't discriminate. See, we got a black guy. We're not sexist. We employ women at all levels. If you've ever heard those things, you're probably experiencing tokenism. Okay. Another question that I had on this was with respect to prejudice and discrimination and so on is subjective versus objective scales. If I were to say that's a small car and that's a large cup of coffee, no one would think that the cup of coffee is bigger than the car. These are relative measures, so they are subjective. The subjective scales are relative measures in relation to. Objective scales are a little bit clearer in their definition. So a small car weighs 3,000 pounds, this large cup of coffee weighs 12 ounces. So if we used weight, it might be a more objective scale. Now the problem is when we ask questions about views or values on any type of issue in our culture, are we using an objective or a subjective scale? On a scale of 1 to 10, how fairly are African Americans treated by the police? Well, your answer depends on a lot of factors that are subjective. This is not a good question. On a scale of 1 to 10, how fairly are Caucasian Americans treated by the police? These are bad questions because they are subjective in nature. We might want to look at how many African American men are killed by police each year, or how many Caucasian American. Those would be much more objective. I can illustrate the problems with subjective scales. If you had a retail job, you're working in a clothing store, an overpriced clothing store, would you want your job performance rated on by your customers or by how many sales you made? Most of us would want to be rated on sales, not on what our customers say about us, because typically what customers say about us, they only say things when they've had bad service and when they're mad at us, right? You are all subjects of discrimination, and that is in most of the cases. I think most of you are single, meaning you're not married, and you're discriminated against in our culture. You pay higher taxes, you pay higher insurance rates, you pay higher rent if you're single. Now, this has nothing to do with you. It has to do with the fact that you're single, and that is discrimination. Treating you differently based on your group membership. Okay? So, what happens when people don't fit our stereotype? Was one of the questions that I wanted you to think about. And the funny thing is that what we usually do is when we meet someone or have a situation which doesn't fit our stereotype, we tend to think of it as an exception. We don't reevaluate our rule or our stereotype. What we tend to do is say, oh, that's an exceptional case. They're different. Only time seems to change stereotypes, and that's pretty scary because we see disconfirming evidence of a stereotype, yet it persists. What we do is we tend to set it aside and move forward with our stereotypes, and that's kind of scary thing. We call this effect cognitive dissonance, and it's not unfortunately, as powerful as we probably like to be. This is a graph that was in your book. I find it pretty crazy and pretty ridiculous. Um, I'd like to spend some time on it, but I think that it's kind of goofy, especially because if you look closely at this, what you see is very, very broad conclusions that I think are contradicted. For example, here's evidence of envy of Asian Americans. Now, it doesn't look like anybody envies anybody. I mean, the height of this bar is supposed to be envy of African Americans, whereas the height of this bar over here is disgust of feminists. Now, that's higher than that, but we don't talk about disgust of feminists or disgust of fundamentalist Christians. We talk about disgust of gay men. But gay men are actually also pitied a lot. So I think the conclusions from this graph are kind of goofy. I don't take much from this graph. I think it's almost meaningless. Last thing I wanted to talk about was essences, and a lot of you put that essences are biological features of something, and that's true. That's one form of essence, but there's another form, and that is that a group, an object, a group, or a thing has a set of characteristics which are necessary to its identity or function. It doesn't have to be biological. Your book says biological, but when we talk about essentialism and essences, we can talk about what is a chair. What is it that makes a chair? Well, a chair is something to sit on. Well, a stool's not a chair, and you sit on that. Well, a chair has 4 legs. Well, I've seen 3-legged chairs. I've seen chairs with 2 legs. A folding chair. How many legs does it have? It might only have apparently 2 legs. So what we think of in essence is it's the things or the stuff or the characteristics what make something this and not that. So in terms of prejudice, stereotypes, and discriminations, what is it? What is essential to being an African American? What is it? What is the stuff that makes a Hispanic American? And the answer is we don't really know. There's nothing essential. Really, we're all from Africa. All of us can trace our ancestors to Africa. What does it mean to be gay or transgender? What are these things? Nobody really knows. Essentialist thinking is really difficult and really problematic, especially when we apply it to other people. Correll, Urland, and Ito. Last thing I want to talk about are these studies that were done on prejudice and discrimination. This is a first-person shooter game in which there were armed targets. Like this is a picture of one of the probably Call of Duty or one of those where you take the perspective of the first person, that what you're playing the video game from the first person perspective. So that's why they call them first person shooter games. And they measured reaction time and how long it takes to shoot, and they also measured event related potentials. And what they found was that black and white targets for most people were processed differently, and that armed and unarmed targets were also processed differently. So this stuff is not surprisingly instantiated in brain activity. Cultural stereotypes influence this processing. So the stronger stereotypes produced larger ERPs or event-related potentials. These are measures of brain activity. Barthlow, Dickter, and Sestir in 2006 found that alcohol makes this all worse. Right, as Homer Simpson says, beer is the source of and solution to all the world's problems. So those two studies are really interesting in that we can measure some of this stuff physiologically. All right,